Wow, this is cute. In a bustling souvenir shop, a man and a woman happily pick up items. My daughter and I, standing beside her, watch them with a chilly gaze. There was a clear difference in atmosphere between us and the two in front of us. The man engaged with the unknown woman over souvenirs in front of us is my daughter's husband, Richard. Richard, unaware that we were there, seems to be enjoying shopping with the woman, looking very intimate. Despite being in public, the two in front of us were talking closely, arms around each other. It was clear as day that my daughter was hurt by witnessing such a scene. The reality before us was so cruel that I wished to shield my daughter's eyes from it. A helpless anger bubbled up inside me, making my body tremble. The Richard who once treasured my daughter seemed nowhere to be found. From their conversation, it seemed they were choosing souvenirs for the family. My daughter gasped next to me as Richard took the woman's arm and touched her face. I glared at Richard over my shoulder. He must atone for toying with and betraying my daughter's feelings. Let's buy this for Mom. I approached Richard from behind upon hearing his words. Oh, for me? Thank you. I am Patricia. After marrying, I was blessed with a child named Linda, who grew up without any troubles. Linda married Richard, a man 3 years her senior whom she met in her tennis club, and now they live separately from us. Richard, my daughter's husband, has always been athletic since his student days, continuing his involvement in the tennis club for a long time. Perhaps because of his long involvement in sports, Richard has always valued hierarchy, treating my husband and me with great respect, a fresh memory. With his tall stature and large build, Richard initially seemed a bit intimidating. However, contrary to my expectations, he turned out to be very affable, and he would say his dimples were his charm point when he smiled. I still remember how openly he introduced himself and showed his friendly nature. He was always laughing, eating a lot, and loved to talk. Linda seemed very happy with Richard, and I felt completely reassured about her married life. The change became noticeable about a year after Linda's marriage. Both Linda and Richard had weekends off and usually spent them together. However, Linda started visiting our house more frequently on her days off. At first, I thought she came to see us, her parents, but since this was a new behavior, I felt a bit puzzled. Seeing Linda somewhat downcast, my parental instincts kicked in. Linda, you've been coming home a lot lately. Is everything okay with Richard? When I asked, Linda looked down and remained silent. We're having a bit of trouble with Richard's mother. Her words, barely above a whisper, caught me off guard. I had met Susan, Richard's mother, during a family dinner before their wedding and at the wedding itself, and didn't have a bad impression of her. Hearing that things were not going well, I felt increasingly uneasy. Listening more to Linda, it turned out that Susan lived within walking distance of Linda and Richard's place and often came over uninvited. She would nitpick Linda's housekeeping and cooking, leaving after making snide remarks. Initially, Linda took her advice to heart, but the frequency and escalation of Susan's comments gradually wore her down. Have you talked to Richard about this? Yes, but he doesn't take my side. It's been a bit draining. Linda's forced smile made my heart ache. Ever since they were dating, Richard had always turned to Susan for advice, and whenever he was unsure about something, he would seek her judgment. When Linda sought advice about her mother-in-law, Richard consistently sided with Susan, eventually even comparing Linda to Susan. Knowing this made Linda feel that discussing her issues was pointless, and lately, she had been bottling it all up. Time passed, and Linda didn't seem eager to return to Richard, leaving our house dejected. I felt sorry for her and wished there was something I could do. Then came Thanksgiving, when Richard and Linda were supposed to visit our home. Just past noon, our doorbell rang. When I opened the front door, there stood Linda and Richard right behind her. "Welcome. Must have been hot outside. Come in, come in. It's been a while. We're here to visit." As always, they were polite, but Richard seemed to have lost his usual charm, appearing somewhat distant. This change in Richard's demeanor made it clear that things weren't going well between him and Linda. Then, during a meal where my husband went to the bathroom and Linda stepped away to take a call from work, I found myself alone with Richard. Perhaps out of boredom, Richard was poking at the cake we had for dessert. Seizing the moment, I decided to ask Richard directly. "Lately, Linda has been visiting us quite often and seems a bit down. Do you know anything, Richard?" I deliberately avoided mentioning the mother-in-law issue, just to see Richard's reaction. Richard seemed to know what I was referring to. He looked uncomfortable and quickly averted his eyes. "No, not really sure. I've been so busy with work lately, I haven't had much time to spare." Richard's evasion of the topic only heightened my suspicion. I wanted to press further, but had to drop it as my husband returned shortly after. In front of us, Linda seemed to be trying hard to not worry us, putting on a brave face. Thanksgiving passed, and Linda's birthday was approaching. Before her marriage, we would celebrate with a family dinner or take a family trip on her day off. However, since she started dating Richard, he would take the day off to celebrate her birthday. After her birthday, Linda would always happily tell me about what Richard did for her and the gifts she received. The relationship between them during Thanksgiving didn't seem as happy as she portrayed. I hoped that Richard would take the day off for Linda's birthday this year too, and maybe their strained relationship would improve. Then, the day before Linda's birthday. Unfortunately, it had been raining since morning, and the forecast predicted rain all day. I hoped for clear weather for Linda's birthday tomorrow, wondering what Richard had planned for her as my husband and I discussed it. We had already picked out Linda's birthday gift and were just about to message her when the doorbell rang. At 8 p.m. It was unusual to have visitors at this time, and I couldn't shake off a bad feeling. Pushing aside my vague apprehension, I hesitantly opened the front door. There stood Linda, drenched from the rain. "Linda, what are you doing out there? You're soaked. Come in right now." I pulled her arm in a panic, forcing her inside. Linda looked like she was on the verge of tears, dripping water everywhere. My husband, coming from the back upon hearing my frantic voice, was also surprised to see Linda. I took a towel he brought over and draped it over Linda's head. Though it was hard to tell because of the rain, Linda was indeed crying, her shoulders shaking with sobs. As I gently wiped her head with the towel, I immediately suspected something had happened between her and Richard. After drying her off a bit, I urged Linda to take a bath, prioritizing warming her up over getting to the bottom of things. Linda obediently went to the bath, and 15 minutes later, she emerged into the living room with a calmer expression. Yet the reason for her tears lingered in my mind, stirring a sense of dread. "I'm sorry for worrying you. I rushed out and forgot my umbrella." "What happened? If you feel like you can talk about it, I'd like to help." I offered her a warm cup of coffee, waiting for her to speak. Linda started to talk, albeit hesitantly. Before coming here today, she had asked Richard about their plans for tomorrow. Richard initially acted as if he didn't know what she was talking about. Feeling something was off, Linda casually mentioned her birthday, and Richard, as if just remembering, claimed he had work. Linda pressed him, dissatisfied. "I have important work. Don't bother me," he retorted sharply. Then Richard continued to pile on the sarcasm towards Linda, eventually declaring he had no intention of celebrating her birthday in the future. After years of celebrated birthdays forgotten, and the domineering attitude of Richard piling up stress, Linda reached her breaking point and left the house. Choking on her words yet managing to tell the story, Linda shared. She always cherished her birthdays, and until last year, it seemed Richard shared the sentiment. A few months ago, on Richard's birthday, Linda had taken a day off for a day trip they had gone on. She didn't expect a return gesture for celebrating, but wondered if there was a reason behind forgetting her birthday and his bullish behavior. It was something I couldn't figure out, no matter how much I thought about it. All I could do was to be there for my daughter in her sadness. After suggesting she rest for today, Linda drank the coffee I prepared and then went back to her room. The next morning, heading to the living room, I found Linda already eating breakfast bread. "Good morning, Linda." "Happy birthday." "Morning." "Yeah, thanks." Linda's eyes, devoid of energy and red, showed she hadn't slept well. I pondered whether to leave her be. But knowing Linda has always been the type to bottle things up when alone, I decided to take her out to a place she likes. "Hey Linda, how about we go grape picking, something you love?" "Grape picking? Really?" Before her marriage, birthdays often involved family trips to eat her favorite grapes. Hearing the name of her favorite, Linda's face brightened a bit. Relieved at her response, I nodded eagerly to her hesitant remark. "Of course. Come on, get ready." I had reserved the grape picking online the night before. Her positive reaction making me excited too. After getting ready, we set off for the venue. The orchard, chosen for its high ratings the previous day, was about a 30-minute drive from our home. Despite being a weekday, the popular spot was bustling. We quickly finished registration and moved to the grapevines. Sunlight filtered through the dense leaves, illuminating patches of ground in a memorable scene. The grapes hung heavily, glistening water droplets on the yellow muscats, translucent purple grapes, and ones nearly dark blue in color. The variety was stunning, and we marveled at the sparkling scene before us. Then, the fragrance of fresh fruit tickled our noses. I took a deep breath, savoring the fruity scent. Looking at Linda, she seemed to be doing the same, enjoying the crisp air. Relieved, I began selecting grapes to eat. Linda chose a rare variety. Her love for grapes evident in her knowledge of types and characteristics, delighted to find her preference. Picking a bunch, Linda tasted a grape. Instantly, she placed her hand on her cheek, eyes closed, savoring the flavor. "It's delicious. Freshly picked is really special, isn't it?" Seeing my daughter's joyous expression made me smile. After finishing hers, Linda helped choose grapes for me, lively explaining their features and tastes. Matching my preferences with the available grapes, I chose a muscat. Its distinctive aroma whetted my appetite. And I too savored the sweet fruit. "Yes, it's really delicious." Linda looked pleased at my words, then suggested we explore more. I happily agreed, and we continued our grape discovery. The orchard boasted a wide variety of grapes, prominently featured on their website as a strength. From small, common grapes to large, perfectly round ones, and even unusually long ones that made you wonder if they were indeed grapes. With many types not seen in supermarkets, Linda observed them with curiosity, tilting her head and changing angles. Watching her engrossed made me glad I brought her grape picking today. How much time had passed? I wondered, looking around to find Linda was gone. It seemed we had both become too engrossed and lost track of each other. Glancing around, I noticed Linda was quite far away, intently observing the grapes. She seemed unaware of our distance, looking up. It had been a while since we'd been grape picking, so I decided to wait a bit longer before calling out to her, wanting her to enjoy the day to the fullest. Then, I heard a couple, presumed to be nearby, making some noise. Listening to their conversation while observing the grapes, it appeared the man, being tall, had bumped his head on the grapes. That moment brought back an old memory of mine. It was before Linda and Richard's wedding, during a family dinner. The restaurant chosen by Linda and Richard had a low entrance, and Richard, being 6 feet 3 inches tall, had bumped his head on the entrance. Ah, man. Being tall can be such a hassle. I remembered Richard's pained reaction and Linda's worried yet laughing face, which made me smile. Then, hearing a familiar phrase, I turned around reflexively. Suddenly, I was so shocked I couldn't move. People bumped into me as I stood still, but I was too focused on the person ahead to care. There was Richard, seemingly enjoying grape picking with an unfamiliar woman. I thought I was mistaken, but the voice I had heard earlier sounded just like Richard's. I hadn't considered Richard being here, so I didn't recognize him by voice alone, but seeing his face made it all too real. Sweat formed in my palm, clenched unconsciously. Richard hadn't noticed me, and I approached from behind, hoping not to be seen. I wanted to believe it wasn't Richard. But seeing the dimple on the man's smiling face dashed any faint hope I had. It reminded me of the day Richard, with a childlike smile, said it was his charm point, feeling as if his face was being erased from my memory. The woman next to Richard appeared to be 2 to 3 years younger than Linda, shorter, with about a foot's height difference between them. Her cute dress and trendy curly hair made her look even younger. Linda, being 5 feet 7 inches tall, didn't have much of a height difference with Richard. Preferring pants over skirts, unlike the woman beside Richard now. Before. I guess it's because we're not much different in height, but people often mistake us for siblings rather than a couple. Linda had said with a hint of sadness, making me feel even more uncomfortable with the two before me. If I didn't know Richard, I might have thought they were a perfect couple. Everyone around probably thought they looked great together, given their cozy mood. Richard and the woman were feeding each other and getting extremely close, not something you'd expect just friends to do. And, most importantly, Richard was supposed to have told Linda he was working yesterday. I couldn't quite grasp the situation and just stared at Richard and the woman. Then, Richard leaned in and kissed the woman. I shuddered at the moment. Anger welled up in me, seeing Richard spending time with another woman on a day he had canceled plans with Linda, claiming it was for her birthday. Looking back to where Linda had been, she was walking away, her back turned to me. I took out my mobile phone from my bag and captured a photo of Richard arm in arm with the woman. Holding the phone tightly after taking the photo, I glared at Richard from a distance, who was touching the woman more than necessary, and went back to looking for Linda. I was able to reunite with Linda shortly after. Seeing how genuinely happy and satisfied Linda looked, I hesitated to tell her about Richard. But I couldn't forgive Richard for betraying Linda with such a calm face. I couldn't just let it go. Linda, don't freak out, but I saw Richard just now. What? Richard? That's impossible. He's at work. Linda insisted it was a mistake, so I showed her the photo on my mobile phone. Linda, staring at the photo, probably wouldn't believe it until she saw it with her own eyes. It was painful to show her the photo, knowing it would hurt her, but it seemed the only way to make her face reality. With resolve, I turned the phone to show Linda the photo of Richard and the woman. Her eyes widened, and soon tears began to well up in her large eyes. No! This can't be! Why? A silence enveloped us, unimaginable amidst the bustling orchard. I supported the listless Linda to a quieter spot and we sat down on a bench. I wasn't sure whether to tell you, but I'm sorry. Especially today, on your birthday. It's okay. I'm glad you told me. I've been feeling something was off lately. Linda seemed to calm down a bit, her emotions shifting from shock to anger. I want to know if it's really an affair. Let's go find out." Despite the confusion, Linda stood up from the bench with determination. I was worried, but if we missed this chance, Richard might talk his way out of it. Without hesitation, I followed Linda, who started walking briskly. I led Linda to where I had last seen Richard, but he was no longer there. Maybe he had already left. Looking around, I spotted Richard and the woman inside a souvenir shop. I quickly informed Linda, and we entered the shop. Richard and the woman were picking up grape keychains, talking about something. We got close enough to hear their conversation. "Hey, this is cute. Let's buy it for my mom." "Right, Betty?" "Yeah, really cute. She'll love it." Linda and I exchanged looks, our anger apparent. Before Linda could speak, I approached Richard and the woman from behind and addressed them. "Wow, getting such a cute gift, are we?" "Thank you." Richard and the woman, absorbed in their own world, jumped when I spoke. Richard turned around, saw me, and held his breath. Obviously, from the woman's perspective, I was just a stranger speaking to them. Richard tried to escape but froze when he saw Linda behind me. "Nice to meet you. I'm Richard's wife." Linda smiled, but her eyes were not smiling. "I'm this child's mother. That makes me Richard's mother-in-law." At this, the woman looked up at Richard in disbelief. "What do you mean?" It seemed the woman had no idea Richard was married. Richard, visibly shaken, didn't try to explain anything. "What is your relationship with Richard?" "I'm in a relationship with him. We even promised to get married." The woman explained that she and Richard had met online and developed their relationship from there. She mentioned that Richard never talked about marriage, nor did he wear a ring or do anything to suggest he was married. Both Linda and I were speechless, hearing the woman speak in a low voice. The idea that Richard was engaged to another woman while hiding his marriage was shocking. "I've even introduced him to my parents. We're engaged, you know? What are you thinking? Robert, I won't forgive this. I'll sue you." The woman, more upset with Richard than either of us, raised her voice, echoing throughout the store. Gradually, more people started to pay attention to us, creating a spectacle in part of the space. Richard, so the work was a lie too. Having an affair. Linda muttered to Richard, which caused the woman, who had been confronting him, to turn towards Linda and start apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. How can I even apologize?" The woman looked like she was about to cry, her eyebrows furrowed in distress. While there was anger towards the woman for laughing with Richard, unknowing of Linda's pain, it became clear she truly knew nothing of the situation. The woman continued to apologize to Linda, and I began to feel sorry for her, realizing she was also deceived. Her sincere reaction made it evident she was a reasonable person. "No, you're a victim too." Linda, though visibly confused, seemed to think it wrong to direct her anger at the woman who had been kept in the dark. Linda implied she wasn't angry at the woman, but the woman, panicking slightly, didn't seem to catch Linda's intention. "With a wife and all, I've done something terrible. Is this an affair? Should I pay some kind of compensation?" The woman knew an affair was wrong, but was unsure of what to do next. Trying to make amends, she even brought up the topic of money. Surprised by the turn of the conversation, Linda gently placed her hand on the woman's. "Please, calm down. No money is needed." The woman seemed to relax a bit at Linda's kindness. Then, Linda, overwhelmed with emotion, turned to Richard and spoke without mercy. "Richard, I can't deal with you anymore, and of course, I'll be asking for compensation." The woman, appearing remorseful, bowed slightly to Linda, realizing all the fault lay with Richard. She began to confront Richard again, glaring at him intensely. As the woman pressed him, Richard panicked and grabbed her hand.
Hey, I was planning to divorce. That means we can get married.
The moment Richard blurted this out, the woman forcefully shook off his hand.
Married? You must be joking. It's definitely off. How could you deceive me this long?
Richard, stunned by her reaction, then turned to Linda.
I'm sorry. I've been out of my mind. Won't you give me another chance? Please, Linda.
Richard reached out to Linda with a desperate look. Then, a sharp sound echoed around. Linda had slapped Richard's hand away.
How can you say something so convenient? Divorce is the only option. I was foolish to trust you.
Shocked by the rejection, Richard staggered and then became motionless, standing in an awkward pose. The other customers, having witnessed the entire scene, whispered about Richard. Linda received sympathetic looks, while Richard was met with pity and disdainful glances. Eventually, the woman gave us a slight nod and left. Richard collapsed to the floor as if drained of all strength. Neither Linda nor I, nor anyone else around, offered him a hand. After a while, a staff member approached Richard, telling him he was causing a disturbance. Still, Richard remained unresponsive. Reluctantly, a male staff member helped Richard up and dragged him to the office. The sight of an adult being led away like that was undignified, eliciting scornful laughs from the onlookers. We watched Richard with cold eyes and left the orchard behind us. Afterward, Richard ended up paying compensation to both Linda and the other woman, and somehow agreed to the divorce with Linda. Richard must have been struggling financially because of the compensation to both Linda and the affair partner, but that was none of our concern. Finally, the divorce was settled, and just when I was feeling relieved, Susan showed up at my house. Knowing Linda was there, as soon as Linda opened the door, Susan began yelling furiously.
What do you mean by this? A divorce? I suppose you're the cause of all this?
It seemed Susan was trying to shift the blame onto Linda. She continued ranting about how her son was the victim and how Linda was being unreasonable. After venting, Susan was out of breath. Then, Linda, with a firm stance, addressed Susan.
If you have complaints, direct them to your son who had the affair. Please stop making baseless accusations. If you continue to cause a scene, I'll call the police.
Backing Linda up, I warned Susan as well, and she seemed surprised by Linda's reaction. She probably expected Linda to be submissive as she had been during her marriage.
I might have tolerated it during our marriage, but I won't be bullied by your harassment anymore.
Linda's strong words left Susan visibly more shocked. Overwhelmed by our assertiveness, Susan awkwardly left. Later, we heard from mutual acquaintances of Linda and Richard that Richard had to quit his job. Apparently, a colleague from the same company as Richard had been present at the grape picking incident. The colleague shared what he witnessed with others at the company, and soon the story spread. The rumor reached the ears of Richard's boss and the company president, who, known for valuing family, reprimanded Richard harshly. Being scolded was one thing, but the rumors within the company didn't fade away. Richard became labeled as the man who took a day off for his wife's birthday to go grape picking with his affair partner. Moreover, the scene of him being dragged away by a staff member also spread within the company, changing how colleagues viewed him. Richard, once serious with prospects for promotion, found his position untenable and ultimately chose to resign. According to mutual acquaintances, after Richard resigned, he and his mother faced financial difficulties, sold their house, and lived on welfare. With Richard's father having passed away years before Richard married Linda, and with no job or assets, life was indeed tough for Richard and the elderly Susan. Linda and I felt no pity for them. It was a situation of their own making. Linda moved back to her parents' house within a month of the divorce, initially appearing as if her spirit had been drained. The divorce went through smoothly, but Linda's sorrow from being betrayed by someone she loved was unimaginable. Considering Linda's state, feeling sympathy for Richard was impossible. My husband and I did our best to support and encourage Linda, who gradually began to regain her former brightness. Half a year after Linda's divorce, I was invited to a friend's house located near where Richard used to live. Knowing I was close to Richard's former residence made me hesitant. But I decided to go, thinking I could ignore any accidental encounter. I had a great time at my friend's house, and on my way home in the evening, I stumbled upon a soup kitchen in a park. Having never seen a soup kitchen around my house before, I was drawn to the unusual sight. Among the crowd, I spotted Richard and Susan. I did a double take, but it was unmistakably them. Wearing tattered clothes, their appearances were unkempt, and their faces were dirty. Richard looked lifeless and seemed much older than his years. Shaken by the drastic change, I paused momentarily but reminded myself that it was a consequence of their actions. I passed by Richard and Susan, who were emotionlessly eating at the soup kitchen, and headed home. Arriving home, I found Linda and my husband excitedly chatting in the living room. "I'm home. What's up? What are you guys talking about?"
Mom, welcome back. We were just talking about the party I went to today.
Time indeed heals, and Linda had slowly come to terms with her situation, now open to new beginnings. I contemplated sharing what I saw about Richard and Susan, but ultimately decided against it. It was a chapter closed for us, and I didn't want to bring back unpleasant memories for Linda, who was trying to move forward. Seeing Linda talk animatedly about a man she met at the party, I sincerely hoped her smile would last forever.